Brothers and sisters, grace to you and peace from God our Father and from our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Amen. So, what is it that makes a picnic different from other types of meals that we enjoy? I would argue that one of the things that makes a picnic different is the table itself. The table at a picnic is not a formally set kind of affair. By its nature, a picnic takes place on more of a rustic, kind of casual kind of table. A lot of times picnic tables, wood, typically weathered depending on where you go. Sometimes a picnic doesn't even take place on a table at all. You put a blanket down on the ground, you sit down and you start eating. And so a picnic by its nature tends to be more casual, tends to be a little bit more rustic in terms of the table in which we gather around. The point of a picnic is always that we do it to have some leisure time. We don't typically have a picnic as the formal meal that we want to have with people. Picnic is supposed to be something where we're more relaxed, where we're just kind of putting up our feet, and where we're enjoying lengthy amount of time around a meal, around some food with our friends. Another thing too is a picnic has a tendency to take place outside. It is not in a room like this. This is not the place that we typically have a picnic unless it's downpouring. Outside is usually where we have it, and part of the reason for having a picnic is because the breeze, the outside, those are the kinds of things that have a tendency to refresh us, to give us life around that meal that we share. Picnic is usually done with some type of self-contained basket. A picnic is not the kind of meal where you're going back and forth to the car for different types of things. You don't go to grab the glazed ham out of the back of the car during a picnic. No. You bring your stuff in a basket, cooler, whatever it is, but you tend to have a self-contained thing that you bring out to where you're going to eat it, and so you don't have multiple platters, you don't have multiple trips to the kitchen, and so forth. And also, a picnic has a tendency to be different from other tables around which we gather, because the food has a tendency to be quite simple as well. The food is the kind of thing that you can identify. Hot dish is not what you typically bring to a picnic, right? Because hot dish you can't eat with your thank you very much. So picnic food has a tendency to be the kind of thing that's more easy to identify. Chicken, grapes, cheese, crackers. These easily identifiable picked up things. You're not going to end up with turkey tetrazzini at a picnic because it doesn't eat well at a picnic. So we're back this week considering these tables around which we gather in our lives and what those different tables and our gathering around them have to do with our faith. And today we consider a picnic table. Now, when you go into the Bible and you look up the word picnic, you will come back with absolutely zero entries. The concept of picnic does not appear in the Bible, and yet there are stories that have kind of a picnicky feel to them. And those stories can help us better understand our faith. And for that, we then turn to this thing called a triclinium. Triclinium. It is not a spot remover for your clothes. It is not an ointment for bug bites. The triclinium were these couches that people back in Jesus' day would lay down upon and would gather around when they got together for certain meals. Triclinium is both the couch itself, it's also the area in which these people would gather for these kinds of meals. Guests would lay on their left side, which left their right arm free to go ahead and pick up food and eat from there. The point, of course, was to dine in a leisurely way. These people would get together for these meals, and it would be the kind of thing where they would be gathered there for hours, conversing, eating, enjoying company, and so forth. The triclinium were placed in open, airy kinds of rooms. They were not typically outside, and yet it was a place that lent itself to kind of a breezy atmosphere. It was oftentimes a very large room that had nothing else in it besides these benches themselves, a table in the middle, and plenty of room around which the servants could get to bring food, to take care of folks, and so forth. And also the food had a tendency to be simple and identifiable as well. This was not a place where people would gather with their biblical hot dish. This is a place where they would not have ox tetrazzini. They would have olives. They would have bread. They would have fish. We do know, too, that around that time, there was this Greek stuff called garum. Garum was this fermented fish paste that was kind of all the rage. It's kind of like what salsa is today. And so they would oftentimes have this garum along with what it was that they were eating, and they would dip their food into that and enjoy it that way. So they may have gotten kind of fancy with some garum, but typically the food was pretty simple as well. And it's around this leisurely, breezy room, this simple-fooded triclinium that we encounter Jesus in our gospel today from Luke. We know this story, and we know the characters in the story. We know about the Pharisee, we know about the woman who has led a very sinful life. We know these usual details. And how does this particular setting, though, this breezy triclinium kind of place, this picnicky type of meal, how does this help us in terms of better understanding how we're to live out our faith? And the bottom line goes down to how Jesus handles this Pharisee named Simon. Notice how Jesus handles the Pharisee. As the story goes, Jesus is reclining at the table on his left side, eating with his right hand, talking to everybody in this leisurely kind of atmosphere. And all of a sudden, around the triclinium, around the outside of the benches, this woman appears from the neighborhood. She's a very simple woman. We don't know exactly what she's done, but it's bad enough that, at least in that community, she is shunned. And she comes, and without making a big scene, she begins to weep, and her tears are enough that they begin to wet Jesus' feet, and she uses her hair to dry off Jesus' feet. And then also we know that she has brought with her an alabaster jar of perfume. This alabaster jar of perfume has probably cost her most of what she has in her savings account. And she comes, and out of faith, wets Jesus' feet, washes them, and refreshes them with this perfume. Now, Simon the Pharisee sees all this going on because he's the host, and he is kind of set in the central spot where he can see everything going on. And what we know from what Luke describes is that Simon says something barely audible. We know from what Luke says that he either mutters to himself under his breath or he just leaves it in his thoughts. But somehow he doesn't say it loud enough for anybody else to hear it. And basically he says, man, if Jesus really knew this lady, he wouldn't have anything to do with her. And this leisurely, breezy, picnicky kind of meal and this spot in the story helps us to understand how this picnic kind of thing can help us with our faith. Because how does Jesus respond to Simon the Pharisee? Simon, I have something to tell you, Jesus said. Tell me, teacher, Simon responds. And what Jesus does there is he handles the Pharisee by letting this light breeziness of leisurely conversation guide Simon the Pharisee to a conclusion that he arrives at on his own. Jesus knows that what Simon's doing is wrong. But how does Jesus tell Simon that he's wrong in a way that's faithful? And what Jesus does is, in the context of this leisurely, breezy conversation, he lets that leisurely conversation guide itself in order to let Simon arrive at the conclusion he should finally go to. This is what Jesus says to Nicodemus in John's Gospel. The wind blows wherever it pleases. You hear its sound, but you cannot tell where it comes from or where it's going. And so it is with everyone born of the Spirit. Jesus is going to let the conversation kind of flow. He's going to let the breeze of the Spirit kind of guide Simon in the place he's going to go. And notice this, because this is very important. What Jesus does not do is he does not rub Simon's nose in fermented fish paste. He does not call out Simon in front of all of his guests and go, "Hey Simon, I heard what you said." Whoa. "Hey Simon, who are you to judge?" See, the second Jesus does that, now we've got conflict. It's as if two people who like two different football teams go at each other. This is what Jesus does, and this becomes very important to our faith. And then what Jesus does is he turns to the woman after he has dealt with Simon. And he's dealt with Simon in a very gentle, leisurely, breezy kind of way. And now when he turns to the woman, he offers her forgiveness in a very direct and a very simple kind of way. Your sins are forgiven, he says to her. And then, as Luke tells us, she really can't quite believe her ears. And so Jesus says to her again, your faith has saved you, go in peace. What Jesus doesn't do here is he doesn't go all hot dish on this lady. He doesn't complicate this and say to the woman, say, because of the doctrine of justification by grace through faith, through me, of course, you're going to be just fine. What he does is he looks at this woman who needs something simple. Olive, bread. That's what she can handle at this point. And he simply says to her, your sins are forgiven. And when she can't quite click onto it, he says it as simply the next time, your faith has saved you, go in peace. And her life has changed right there. This is what Jesus does at this leisurely meal to deal with both the one who sinned as well as the one who is going after the sinner. Picnic tables, I think, these days have gotten to be more kind of like concrete. You go to a lot of parks these days, and you look for a picnic table. How often have you seen picnic tables that are made out of concrete? More and more often when I go to parks are installing picnic tables like the one in the picture. They are functional, but they're hard. And let's honor the 8th commandment with our park districts. They're probably putting in these concrete picnic tables because they last long, right? Because in the long run, it saves the district money. Can't fault them for that. But what I tend to find is that as we go to these parks more and more, and we encounter these types of picnic tables, they're not as cozy and warm as they used to be, right? They're hard. I mean, even when you put a blanket on top of it, it still is, boom, right? Hard as a rock. They're not as comfortable to gather around. And so the way we tend to act with our faith in this world is I think we tend to act the way that a lot of picnic tables are. We act as hard with how we deal with other people in our faith as these picnic tables that are going into these community parks. We in our world these days have a tendency to be off-putting with folks. We have a tendency to be breeze-stifling with folks. More so than any time that I can think of. Correct me if I'm wrong. Our discourse in this country is pretty harsh, pretty shrill with each other. Look at social media, look at what's happening in the world, and the way we talk to each other is just downright mean a lot of times. Again, as I said to the kids, we can't even watch football games and not get into that kind of posture. Bob and I go after each other every single week, but it's always in fun. I know Bob doesn't mean to hurt me when he jokes because it's just that, it's a joke, right? I trust that Bob knows the same thing about me, because when Bob comes at me, I'm coming right back, right? No, but it's all in good fun. We have lost that in our world these days. We have become, in the way we talk to each other and the way we deal with each other, more like these hard picnic tables than like the old ones. And so, what can picnic tables teach us about our faith these days? I think for the first thing, picnic tables in their best form are kind of soft. They're made out of wood. They're not made out of concrete. They're the kind of thing that when you sit down on the bench, it gives a little bit. When you put food on it, it gives a little bit. When you put your elbows on the table, which I know you shouldn't do, but I do it anyway. When you put your elbows on the table, it's not rough and it doesn't end up needing a Band-Aid when you're done. Picnic tables, in their best way, in their wooden form, have this tendency to give a little bit. That doesn't mean that they don't have structure. It doesn't mean that they don't have form. It doesn't mean that when you look at it, you can't tell clearly what that picnic table stands for. You can. When you sit on it, when you gather around it, it's a little bit softer. It has a little bit of give. And, as their setting encourages, picnic tables in their best way are enjoyed outside where the breeze can blow around you. Guys, a lot of times when we get caught up in difficult situations, some of the best medicine is to go out and do what? Take a walk. Just go out and get some fresh air. Let the breeze blow, let the sun shine down on you, and things have a tendency to look a little bit better when you're done. Same thing with picnic tables. They're meant to be enjoyed outside. How do we go ahead and put this kind of picnic table-like faith into action? For that, I turn to an example that Rosemary experienced here just last week. Rosemary went to a salon, and this nice young lady was taking care of her. And of course, as you have a tendency to do, guys, when you go to barbershops, lady, when you go to the salon, the person who's cutting your hair is chatting with you and that sort of thing. That's what was happening with Rosemary. And what Rosemary started to notice is that this young lady, nice as she was, man, she talked pretty coarsely. She swore like a sailor. Not that there's anything wrong with sailors. Bob was a sailor, right? But she swore a lot. And she was really kind of coarse in the way that she looked at the world. And it was starting to bug Rosemary. Rosemary was starting to get kind of uncomfortable. Now, how could Rosemary have dealt with that situation? Say, can we stop using the blue language a little bit? That's one way, but that's this way, right? Say, I want you to know that I'm offended. That kind of way. The woman continues talking, and somehow they get on the topic of kind of what's been going on during the last week, and Rosemary says to the young lady, say, we just went and picked up my son from a 2.5-week Bible camp. Do you know what stopped after that moment? How do we act more like picnic tables? How can a picnic table inform our faith? A picnic table has form. We know what a picnic table stands for. We need not be a beanbag chair in terms of how we live out our faith. But neither do we need to be like concrete. And so this wooden picnic table, I think, is a perfect application for how we're to live out our faith. Rosemary had a choice in that moment. She could have just said very clearly, I find what you're saying offensive. And you know what? The response could have been, well, fine for you, but this is my truth. Right? This is how we act these days. Something riles us up, we come at it like this. Rosemary chose a different way. Rosemary was able to maintain the form of what is true and godly, but to do it in a way that encouraged leisurely conversation and, by its nature, kind of curtailed the stuff that wasn't as appreciated. That's what we're called to do, my friends. This is what a picnic table has to do with our faith. When it comes to dealing with other people, even Vikings fans, we are called to continue the conversation. Okay, fine. Even Packers fans, come back. Let's be equal opportunity. We're called to continue the conversation, to engage in leisurely conversation, to ask genuine questions. Bob, why do you like them? But because I like you, Bob, I want to know. And guys, as we're standing here this morning, we always have a good time, right, brother? It's never serious. This is how it should be. We need to have leisurely, fun conversation. We are not to rub the other person's nose in fermented fish paste. Don't make them feel badly. Trust and allow the breeze of the Holy Spirit to enter into your leisurely conversation and to do the changing for you. And when it comes to forgiving, which is another part here too that has to be done, when it comes to forgiving other people, finish the statement. I can forgive, but I can't. Does God forgive but cannot forget? No. God forgives and then He absolutely forgets. When it comes to forgiveness, my friends, the forgiveness that we offer to people does not need to be like a mishmash of a hot dish. In fact, it's not the wisest way to do it. When we forgive, let us forgive simply and directly. Not go hot dish on the person and talk to them about the doctrine of justification by grace through faith. Bob, you sinned against me. You are forgiven. Go in peace. and we'll see how the standings work out at the end of the season. No. This is how we're to deal with each other. We are to trust and allow the Spirit to do what the Spirit wants to do with who the Spirit wants to do it. It's not my choice as to whether or not the person who has sinned against me is going to be forgiven. That's beyond my pay grade, my friend. My job is to declare. God has forgiven. My job is to declare, and my job is to let go. To do it simply, to do it directly. And so, guys, I think this is what a picnic has to do with faith. It has to do with dealing with people in gentle, simple ways that help them to see and experience for themselves the way that the Spirit works in their lives and brings them to the knowledge and to the being embraced by the love of God that comes through Jesus Christ. Amen. I'll invite you all to please stand.